You know, when we think about the American West, the images are just iconic, right? Huge open plains, tough-looking cowboys, this relentless march of progress. It's really a foundational story for America. But what if that story we all know is only half the picture? Let's pull that myth apart and see what's really going on. Just take a second and think about it. The phrase Wild West, it probably brings up a whole movie reel in your head, right? A kind of myth of heroism and independence and adventure that's been burned into American culture for more than 100 years. But where did that story actually come from? And maybe more importantly, what did it leave out? This quote right here, it gets to the very heart of it. See, the story of the American West isn't one single story. It's two, and they're happening at the exact same time. On one hand, you've got a story of incredible opportunity and expansion, and on the other, at the same moment, a story of just catastrophic loss and conquest. So in this explainer, we're going to look at both.
Okay, so first, let's talk about the triumph side of things. After the Civil War, you see this absolute tidal wave of American settlers pouring across the Mississippi River. And this wasn't just a trickle, it was a flood, really, driven by some seriously powerful forces and the promise of a totally new life.
A huge piece of that promise was land, and the government made an offer that was, well, almost impossible to refuse. The Homestead Act of 1862 basically gave away 160-acre plots of federal land. All you had to do was pay a tiny fee and live on it, work it for 5 years. For hundreds of thousands of people, this was a chance at a life they could never, ever have dreamed up back east.
But it wasn't just about farming. Not at all. The West was like this giant magnet, pulling people for all sorts of different and sometimes competing reasons. You had prospectors totally convinced they were going to strike it rich with gold and silver. You had hunting teams just decimating the bison herds for their hides to supply factories back east. And you had groups like the Mormons looking for a safe haven to practice their faith without persecution. All these things were pulling people west, creating boom towns and brand new economies seemingly overnight.
But this explosion of growth came at a staggering environmental price. I mean, look at this. The demand for those tough bison hides was just insatiable. So in the span of a few decades, just one lifetime, a population of over 10 million animals was essentially wiped out, down to just a few hundred. This wasn't just hunting. It was a permanent re-engineering of the entire ecosystem and a terrifying sign of the sheer power of this westward push. So what was the technology that made all of this possible? What connected all these different ambitions and people? Well, it was one thing above all else: the railroad. You really can't overstate this. The railroad wasn't just another industry in the West. In a lot of ways, it was the West. It was the iron artery that connected Eastern money to Western resources, moved people and supplies at speeds that were just unimaginable before, and it totally annihilated the time and distance that had always kept the continent separated. And the federal government was totally on board. To get this whole thing built, they gave their railroad companies over 175 million acres in land grants. To put that in perspective, that is an area of land larger than the entire state of Texas. It just goes to show you that the settlement of the West wasn't some spontaneous thing. It was a massive, government-subsidized national project. But here's the thing. That national project, that wave of expansion, it collided head-on with the 250,000 native people who were already living there. So now we have to look at the other side of the story, the tragedy. For the indigenous peoples of the West, American expansion meant one thing: dispossession, confinement, and a series of brutal, relentless wars. When we talk about the Indian Wars, it's easy to think of it as one big conflict, but it wasn't. It was really a long, grinding series of separate, incredibly violent clashes that went on for decades. These were brutal fights over land, over resources, and really over the very right to exist. And this wasn't just warfare between armies. An event like the Sand Creek Massacre shows you just how horrific it could be. You had a Cheyenne camp led by Chief Black Kettle, who was actively trying to make peace and believed he was under the U.S. government's protection, and a U.S. militia attacked them. The victims weren't soldiers in a battle, they were families and they were slaughtered. Now, beyond the direct violence, the main tool of federal policy was the reservation system. The whole goal was to clear the land for railroads and for settlers, and the way to do that was to force native groups onto these specific territories. The problem was, these reservations were always shrinking. Treaties would be made, and then just a few years later, they'd be broken, pushing tribes onto land that often couldn't even support their way of life. This quote from Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce: It just captures the absolute exhaustion and despair of that time. He said this after leading his people on an incredible 1,000-mile fighting retreat trying to get to safety in Canada. They were caught just miles from the border. His words have become this powerful, heartbreaking statement that gives a real human voice to the immense cost of this conquest.
So you've got this incredibly complicated and violent and tragic reality. How on earth do we get from that to the simple, heroic myths of the West that we all know today? Well, to figure that out, we have to take a closer look at its most famous character, the American cowboy.
The gap between the myth of the cowboy and the reality is just enormous. The legend is this rugged, independent hero, right? The actual truth? It was a low-wage laborer doing dangerous, dirty, back-breaking work. And the idea that cowboys were all white? Not even close. The workforce was incredibly diverse. Historians figure about 1 in every 4 cowboys was black, and a huge number were Mexican or Mexican-American. In fact, a lot of the cowboy culture actually came from the Mexican vaquero tradition.
This same gap between the shiny myth and the harsh reality, it also applied to government policy. Take the Dawes Act. It was sold to the public as this great humanitarian reform. We're going to civilize Native Americans by turning them into independent farmers just like us. But what it actually did was shatter tribal governments, break up their communally owned land, and then sell off the millions of acres of so-called surplus land to white settlers.
Okay, so how did this complex, often brutal history get polished up, packaged, and then sold to the American public as this simple story of heroic adventure? Well, that brings us to the myth-making machine itself. Before the myth could really take hold, the real conflict had to have one last, brutal end, and that was the Wounded Knee Massacre. The U.S. cavalry, fearing a spiritual movement called the Ghost Dance, intercepted a band of Lakota. A tense situation exploded, and the cavalry opened fire, killing up to 300 men, women, and children. With the Indian Wars now effectively over, the stage was finally clear to transform this very recent, very violent history into entertainment. With the real fighting finished, the West was very quickly repackaged. You had cheap little dime novels that turned outlaws and scouts into huge legends. The contests that cowboys had among themselves evolved into organized rodeos. But nothing, and I mean nothing, was bigger than the Wild West shows, especially the massive traveling spectacle run by Buffalo Bill Cody. And think about how surreal this is for a second. Buffalo Bill hired real cowboys, but he also hired real Native Americans, including warriors who had literally fought in the very battles they were now reenacting every night for cheering crowds. Historical trauma was being repackaged into a thrilling, safe spectacle. They were turning recent enemies into paid performers in a kind of historical theme park. And this whole myth even got its own academic stamp of approval. In 1893, a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner came out with his famous frontier thesis. He argued that the unique American character, our grit, our democracy, it was all forged right there on the frontier, on this moving line between what he himself called savagery and civilization. So this theory took the violent conquest and reframed it not as a tragedy, but as the very process that made America America. With this one famous line, Turner basically declared that the frontier was officially closed. The U.S. Census couldn't find a clear, unbroken line of settlement anymore. And in that moment, the messy, complicated, violent history of the 19th century West was sealed shut, put in a box labeled the past. And the myth of triumphant progress became the official story. And that brings us to one last, really important question. The story of the heroic Wild West is powerful for sure, but we know it's a huge simplification of a history that was a lot more complicated and, for many people, a lot more tragic. So what's the legacy of that myth? What happens when a nation's defining story leaves out half the people in it? That is something worth thinking about.